Welcome to the Workers' Reading Room. Today I'll be reading 8 Pieces of Empire by Lawrence Scott Sheets. This is Part 3, Azerbaijan and Armenia at War. Azerbaijan, Life-Saving Carpets. It was hard to fathom that we were nearing the site of battles and an unfolding humanitarian emergency. Driving deeper into Azerbaijan, there were no signs of war. No army transports, no armed columns, and no sense of alarm. Moving closer to the point where refugees were reportedly pouring out, we saw only the occasional car or farm tractors, tilling fields. It was not until we got to the base of the mountains, near the town of Kanlar, that I saw the large crowd gathered in a clearing. A woman among hundreds flailed her face with dirty fingernails the size of small daggers, blood squirting as she ripped flesh from her own cheeks. Her delirious screams were soon joined by others in a cacophony of ritual mourning, reaching a peak with blood streaming from scores of self-gouged faces, turning patches of melting snow scarlet. The Azerbaijani woman had just walked 3 days through the icy passes of the Muraf Mountains, together with thousands of her fellow townsfolk from Kebab, which had just been conquered by Armenian forces. Kebab province had once been home to 60,000, but now all who survived were on the move over the still snow-covered mountains. The first wave of refugees had been able to jam themselves into overloaded trucks that inch along through the icy passes laden down with everything from goats to refrigerators. Another small batch was plucked to safety by overloaded Azerbaijani helicopters with minimal possessions on the day of the final Armenian assault. The third wave, like the hysterical woman gouging her face into a cratered valley of scars, had been forced to flee on foot, hiking over the treacherous Murafs, while dropping virtually everything of value when it became too heavy to carry as exhaustion set in. The least lucky were the unknown numbers of people who fell into snowbanks and froze to death along the way, or those taken hostage to be used as future bargaining chips for everything from fallen bodies to fuel. The morning had begun languidly enough, part of what made living in the conflict-strewn Caucasus Mountains in the early 1990s was Tbilisi, with its sad but elegant decrepitude. The Georgian capital then was essentially lawless, but there was still that casual tranquility to it all, another paradox to its war zone label. The dawn hours in my unheated and usually electricity-less apartment were deceivingly peaceful. I lived in the heart of the city. The pace of Georgian mornings is deliciously slow. Only Kurdish women sweeping the streets broke the silence, alighting with their straw brooms before dawn and disappearing quickly, rendering themselves seemingly invisible during daylight. Men on horseback trundled by the window occasionally. They barked "Matsoni" to advertise homemade Georgian yogurt in glass jars covered with scraps of old newspapers, jangling in rough-hewn satchels at the side of their mounts. Muffled arias wept from the windows of the Tbilisi State Conservatory across a narrow lane. It was all in vivid contrast to the standard Tbilisi night noise of squabbling drunks, the fighting packs of feral dogs, some rabid-looking, and the occasional rapping of random, unexplained gunfire. The bursts of bullets bred frequent morning speculation, focusing on the question of whether there had been a very real shootout or just celebratory volleys from a drunken wedding reception or party. Tbilisi lies at the rough geographic center of the Caucasus, and those few reporters living there were thus never more than a few hours' drive from any number of ethnic and civil wars or upheavals. Abkhazia, Chechnya, Russia's violent northern Caucasus region, the South Ossetian Georgian conflict, and the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia over the mountainous territory known as Nagorno-Karabakh. One early April morning of that year, my rickety rotary phone began clanging away. I hesitated to pick up the receiver, wanting to believe it to be maybe just another wrong number. It rang and rang, and I began to fantasize that I could hurl the phone across the room or rip it out of the wall and no one would ever know. Telephone connections from anywhere to Georgia were by now notoriously unreliable. At one point, the entire country had exactly 8 international phone lines. We wined and dined 2 of the international operators, sisters by the names of Nato and Nanuka, who thus allowed us to jump our turn, which was indispensable as even calls to Moscow had to be ordered up to 2 days in advance. The ringing subsided, but as I drifted back to sleep, it began to rattle again, this time not stopping. This was not the typical short ring of an inner-city connection, but the telltale non-stop bell hammer that in the USSR indicated a long-distance call. This was never a good sign, because it was almost certainly some Reuters editor in London demanding news from another conflagration, battle, explosion, or other calamity in a place that he or she couldn't pronounce. I picked up the phone. On the other end of the line, speaking through an echo chamber of static, I heard the voice of an apologetic young British woman calling from the central Reuters desk in London. It was about Nagorno-Karabakh. There were reports of thousands, no one knew how many, of Azerbaijani refugees fleeing an Armenian offensive, and Reuters wanted me to check out fact from fancy, and fast. Nagorno-Karabakh, Black Garden, was the first of many long-dormant ethnic disputes to erupt as Gorbachev loosened the reins over the empire. The Azerbaijanis and Armenians had been quietly disputing control over the technically autonomous Azerbaijani region for decades. Armenians claim that the region is an indelible part of the Armenian motherland, and thus part of the first self-declared Christian state in the early 4th century. Many Azerbaijani historians maintain that it was part of the ancient Alban state, not Albanians, most of whom converted to Islam in the 7th century and Turkified themselves in the 11th and 12th centuries. The remaining Alban Christians, the Azerbaijanis maintain, were forcibly Armenianized in the 19th century, a notion utterly rejected by most Armenian historians as complete delirium. And that is the easy part. The trigger was set off by the low-level violence going on in and around Nagorno-Karabakh since the late 1980s, anti-Armenian pogroms in Azerbaijan, and a plea by the local Supreme Soviet, dominated by the majority Armenians there, to be transferred to Armenian control. They contended Stalin had illegally transferred the region to Azerbaijani control, partially as a divide and rule tactic. I hung up and started dialing contacts for more information, the sum of which was that the Armenians had attacked a particularly strategic and vulnerable part of Azerbaijan called Kelbajar, which was a pure Azerbaijani province, not part of the Nagorno-Karabakh autonomy. This raised the specter of a total war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, not just over the relatively isolated mountain region, a situation that might provoke Azerbaijan's ally Turkey to get involved, or Russia on the Armenian side. Others speculated. Just as ominously, then there were the reports of the thousands of Azerbaijani refugees fleeing through the few icy passes of the Murov mountain range, which peaked at 3,700 meters, or 14,000 feet, and which bottled up Kelbajar to the north. Some reports suggested that hundreds might have frozen to death. Only a few media outlets, the BBC for example, and the veteran war reporter Thomas Goltz, who was based in Azerbaijan, had gotten hold of a crisis emerging in Kelbajar. Given the tiny foreign correspondent contingent in the region, Nagorno-Karabakh was a war competing for shelf space with a host of other tragedies, most notably in Bosnia and Afghanistan. Still, rumored reports of tens of thousands of refugees pouring out of a place few could pick out on a map demanded attention. Wearily, I prepared to drive toward the calamity. I called Nodar, my nicotine-fingered, cigarette basso profundo-voiced driver. Good-spirited but unenthused, he set off south toward the border with Azerbaijan in his moving chunk of scrap metal, a 3-speed 1972 Soviet Volga. Even though there was a border post in those early post-Soviet days, it was a casual one to say the least. On the Georgian side, 2 or 3 men sat in an old traffic police booth, rarely bothering to stop anyone except the drivers of Turkish and Iranian-plated long-haul trucks from whom bribes could be extracted. The barrier was a dirty rope, which, from inside the booth, the ever-smiling Georgians simply let droop down to the ground so we could pass. The Azerbaijani side was more formal, crawling with customs bureaucrats. Despite the legions of them, there was nothing that could not be brought through for the right informal fee. There were layers and redundant layers of border police asking the same questions, often scouring passports to check whether one had visited Armenia, a red flag meaning a possible spy had been nabbed. Likewise, Azerbaijani stamps could elicit suspicions at the Armenian frontier. An Azeri guard led us through, entranced in the importance of raising a red and white steel bar rather than lowering an old rope, as on the Georgian side. We entered Azerbaijan at war. The road scenery was deceivingly majestic. The sun was coming over the spectacular mountains in the distance, as if the war we knew to be ahead were a mirage. We passed shepherds driving herds of sheep, like they did every day. Smoke drifted from chimneys as tea house keepers by the side of the road stoked fires to prepare shish kebab for customers. After 2 or 3 hours of driving, we finally came to the clearing with the woman digging bloody trenches into her face and screaming. At least she had made it to the bottom of the mountain. One still missing, stuck in the high ranges of the Mirov Pass, was one of our local reporters, my friend Khalid Askarov. Himself a native of Kelbajar, his father, Shamil, was the acknowledged head of the Kurdish community in Azerbaijan and the chief of the prized local carpet museum. While Khalid had for several years been living in the Azerbaijani capital of Baku, he went home to Kelbajar as a reporter. Khalid stayed because his father had refused to leave, believing that the Azerbaijani garrison would stand and fight and that reinforcements were on the way. An Armenian grad rocket ripped a hole in the roof of his house. Even then, sensing he would never see his homeland of Kelbajar again, Khalid's father insisted on gathering up whatever represented his life's work, the library, the carpets, before escaping when it was almost too late. Khalid's father, Shamil, was not the only one to choose those painstakingly hand-woven, naturally dyed carpets to carry over the bone-chilling mountain passes, rather than their old family cars or abundant flocks of sheep and goats. The carpets would be the surviving shards from their fragmented lives. Sentimentalism was not the only driving force for choosing carpets over livestock. Khalid and his family set out over the pass together with some of the last refugees to get out, on foot, snow and wind at times blinding. Many did try to drive their goats and sheep up the mountain, only to see them collapse and freeze to death along the way. There were no guarantees a sheep or a goat would make it through. We knew the carpets could, Khalid later told me after the ordeal ended. A thoroughly gentle person, he somehow managed to smile. At the summit, as the temperature and wind turned lethal, the carpets, stars shining overhead, were unfurled right there, in that moonscape, and put on like robes, those struggling towards safety wrapping themselves, their offspring, and their elderly safely away in them through the pass. The carpets, spun from the same wool as the sheep left behind, literally saved them. The carpets would then perform another mini-miracle, serving as sustenance at the end of the road, when the hellish trek ended in homelessness. The cherished fabrics a form of hard currency to restart their fragmented and homeless new lives as refugees. A single one could cost hundreds of dollars. Even in those threadbare days, an extended family with enough of them could trade them for cash, enough to eat for a while, with maybe something left over to start a tiny business. With no sign or word from Khalid, I looked around for any indication of the usual international relief effort associated with conflict zones. It was timid, to say the least. What I had seen so far had been a single Azerbaijani man with a megaphone shouting himself hoarse in the throat, trying to instill some sense of order at the makeshift camp near Hanlar. News about the catastrophe, as it were, consisted of the decision of the government of President Abulfaz Elchibey to declare emergency law throughout the land. The Armenian conquest of Kelbajar, the people freezing to death in the mountains buried at the end of the story, almost an afterthought. Later that evening, I bedded down for the night in a Fleabag hotel in the nearby city of Ganja. In the grim, tacky bar in the hotel's first floor, blaring with unlistenable Soviet pop music and decorated with cheap disco-style lighting despite tragedy all around, I met Billy Nordstrom, a stocky, lonely, and lone logistics coordinator from the UN High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR. "This is the most challenging situation I've ever faced," he said grimly. He knew that people were freezing to death in the mountain passes, but using Azerbaijani helicopters to try to pluck people from the side of mountains was simply an invitation to the Armenians to shoot them down, military helicopters being indiscernible from those ferrying refugees. The UNHCR man spoke of organizing a humanitarian corridor, an internationally backed agreement to allow a more aggressive rescue effort. But time was short, organizational details daunting. Nordstrom's limited ability to achieve results had him frustrated and angry. As a logistics man, he assumed there were dozens of bureaucrats between him and decisions that determined who might live and who might die. Just getting news out that the exodus was continuing was maddening. The people manning the phone at the hotel made half-hearted attempts to dial the operator and hand me the phone, the operator indifferently responding that all the lines to Moscow were busy and that I should try again in the morning. Finally, I lost my temper, mixing expletives with a half-coherent ramble about the crisis afoot and people freezing to death in the mountains and nobody, in their own country what's more, caring. The operator kept up her outer indifference, but evidently at the expense of some of her conscience. After 5 minutes, I was on the phone to Moscow, relaying new information to the desk from the UN man that tens of thousands could be trapped. The story was getting bigger. The next morning I ventured up the road leading back to Kelbajar, where I met more frozen-to-bone refugees coming out, straggling to safety, some holding babies, others with a few possessions or their beloved carpets, now their only currency and nest eggs for starting over. "I am a new refugee. I will give you a good price on my family rug," one mumbled, tugging at my arm. Others, like a farmer in tattered clothes, were more philosophical. "Where is the help? We were left to die up there in the freezing mountains. Yesterday I was walking next to an old man. He finally could go no farther and just collapsed in the snow," he said, adding, "I don't know where the international community is looking," revealing sophistication as to how the international system and Azerbaijan worked or did not. The war over Nagorno-Karabakh had already created hundreds of thousands of refugees on both sides and widespread destruction. Amid the hundreds of battles, Kelbajar was just another previously unheard of dot on the map. But this battle was very different in two ways. The first was simple treachery. On this day, a day after having arrived in the area, I still failed to encounter a single Azerbaijani soldier. This, I thought, was extremely odd. If the Azerbaijanis were being driven out of Kelbajar, then I thought it certain that troops would be sent in to at least reinforce what remained of Azerbaijani positions or to help with the rescue effort. Instead, I saw nothing. The reason for this, it quickly emerged, was that Surat Husseinov, the former Azerbaijani generalissimo recently stripped of his overall command because of the Azeri military collapse in recent weeks, had ordered his troops back to barracks, leaving the defense of the front lines up to policemen and Green National Army troops under a different and incompetent command. A wool merchant who had managed to amass a fortune in the declining days of the USSR, when access to state-subsidized goods mixed with a little entrepreneurial imagination could lead to quick and substantial gain, Husseinov had committed this act of brazen self-interest out of a political disagreement with Azerbaijan's Popular Front president, Abulfaz El-Chibay. His surname was self-adopted, intended as an important-sounding moniker meaning Mr. Ambassador. Husseinov had essentially chosen to cede Azerbaijan's most strategically important regions, in order to humiliate and bring down the Alchebe government before promising oil deals with foreign petroleum companies could be signed and implemented, evidently so greedy for a cut that he was ready to help effectively sell off part of his country for it. Weird and wicked, yes, yet such clan-based intrigues plagued Azerbaijan throughout the war and were ultimately a major factor in what would turn into an astounding defeat at the hands of the numerically smaller but highly motivated Armenians. The fall of Kelbajar marked another turning point in the war. The conflict had started as a battle over Nagorno-Karabakh, but now washed outside that territory as defined on maps. Thus it was the start of a long and painful process that would last another full year, and which would see Azerbaijan lose vast tracts of territory while gaining hundreds of thousands of refugees as its leadership bickered over responsibility for each tactical defeat. At the end of the process, represented in a poison chalice ceasefire agreement in May 1994, Armenian forces would occupy some 14% of Azerbaijani territory, including all of Nagorno-Karabakh and more, an accurate demonstration that the often Kremlin-designed borders of USSR republics held little sanctity. Khalid Asgarov and his relatives miraculously did finally reach the capital, Baku, where Khalid had been living since student days and his career as a photographer. At one point, 22 relatives were living with him in an old rented house, miles from the city center. He pleaded with me to buy one of the carpets from his aunt. I said I couldn't do it, that I didn't want one, but I eventually relented, Khalid insisting that the deal was vital to the family's well-being and fair. He refused my offer of cash with no carpet as compensation, offended with me, disgusted with the idea. Each of the intricate, spectacular multicolor rugs was eventually sold off in this way, until finally they were gone, their roles and destinies fulfilled. Armenia, a faded tintype of Mount Ararat. The night landscape after crossing the border from Georgia into Armenia changes almost immediately, pine forests warping into a rocky, harsh, and often treeless terrain of severe mountain slopes covered in snow. With little foliage to absorb the bright moonlight, the earth takes on a surreal appearance, and the icy cold takes on a strange sense of lunar warmth. I set out with Alexis Roll of the BBC, a notoriously irreverent, bespectacled, sharp-witted hooligan of a young correspondent. He was one of the first to report on the capture of Kelbajar and the biggest shift in the undeclared war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. After crossing the new international frontier, we reached Stepanovan, a grim Soviet-esque splinter of a town hugging the bank of the Dzoriget River. The main point of interest was a spot near the center of town. On this freezing morning, a gaggle of men had assembled around several dozen 20-gallon jerry cans of precious gasoline. We haggled first, not over the price, but over the source of the fuel. It was well known that some suppliers watered down their product with water. When asked if this was the case, one of the merchants shrugged, an answer translating as, "There are no guarantees." This could mean anything from our buying 72 octane, a smuggled Azerbaijani grade that would gum up an engine faster than cotton candy sticks to your beard, to jet fuel, which would fry the pistons in most Soviet-built cars such as our Niva. I advised rolling the dice and filling up. We had only a quarter tank left. But Alexis, evidently trusting some hidden sixth sense, vetoed that. "Let's drive on," he said, sneering at the knot of dubious gasoline hawkers and confident we would not end up petrol-less in the middle of a frozen landscape. We passed through the desolate southbound road toward Yerevan, winding a downward trajectory through Spitak, the epicenter of Armenia's 1988 earthquake. It was littered with the remains of dozens of shoddily constructed Brezhnev-era high-rise buildings that had collapsed, killing 25,000 people. Adding to this sense of gloom, we saw almost no lighted buildings. Occasionally, a candle or an oil lamp flickered in a window. Azerbaijan had cut natural gas supplies to Armenia for the obvious reason that the two countries were at war, and a second gas line through Georgia was regularly sabotaged by Georgian citizens of Azerbaijani descent in acts of solidarity with their ethnic kin. To top it off, Armenia's Metsamor nuclear power plant had been shut down as a security precaution since the 1988 earthquake. In a word, Armenia was darkened into a brownout lasting years. This was the infamous 1992-93 winter when park trees were felled in the capital, Yerevan, for firewood, and scavengers allegedly burned parquet flooring to keep from freezing. Much of this suffering was real, but some stories, such as dog owners eating their pets to ward off famine, were most likely hyperbole. Still, hyperbole can be useful in galvanizing a sense of bitterness and victimization, and tapping into the omnipresent feeling of oppression, struggle, and survival through which many Armenians identify their national historical experience. We approached Yerevan. At one windswept road, crossing under an inert stoplight, we espied another group of unshaven men hawking gasoline from large jars. The merchant claimed his product had been brought in from Russia and was super grade. Alexis sniffed it with a discriminating twist of his nose, as if degusting a rare Cabernet, and told the man to fill up our tank. We paid him and sputtered into Yerevan, the engine backfiring only a dozen times or so. "Are you on our side or for the Turks?" screeched the reception woman at the grim Divine Hotel. It was the first thing she said, before anything about the keys or telling us what time breakfast would be. Pointing out that Armenians were fighting Azerbaijan and not Turkey was pointless. In this woman's mind, and those of many others, it was all part of the same pattern. The Karabakh War was just another Turkish effort to exterminate them, a logical extension of the almost impossible to fathom Metz-Yagern genocide of an estimated 1.5 million Armenians at the hands of the dying Ottoman Empire, present-day Turkey, during World War I. I asked for coffee. "Turkish coffee, if you have it," I said, biting my tongue a bit too late and requesting the thimble-like small cups heated in copper urns. The woman scowled. "Armenian coffee, you mean?" The corridors of the hotel were dank and dark. Even when the power was on, the voltage was dreadfully low. Light bulbs glowed as if tarnished with wood stain. I caught myself hypnotically staring directly at the dim filaments, experiencing no discomfort. Our floor woman, a busybody Soviet holdover who distributed room keys and kept an eye on guests, slowly prepared the coffee over a makeshift spiral heater that barely seemed to emit any heat at all. Attached to it was a piece of metal spiral plugged into a socket that seemed to be falling out of the wall, two misshapen holes between shards of copper. The death-trap sockets, the power outages, the pervasive feelings of deprivation and darkness, the stories of hunger, the stories of the shelling of Karabakh, and the siege mentality, all seemed to conspire to recreate the essence of the Metz-Yagern, echoes of excruciating pain. Indeed, no other city I had been in conveyed the same sense of heaviness and a certain depression as did Yerevan in those days. A Muslim trading post turned into the happenstance capital of a rump Armenian empire, Yerevan could brood like no other city. The buildings projected a gloomy sternness, tufa rock facades with their hands on their hips, all defiantly facing in one direction, Mount Ararat. It is doubtful that there has been a national symbol sadder or more compelling than the old volcanic cone, where Noah and his ark allegedly found terra firma after the biblical flood. For centuries it had been regarded as the center of the Armenian experience. But since the 1921 Treaty of Kars between the USSR and present-day Turkey, this most resonant symbol of Armenianness had been just over the border in the land of the enemy and is thus thrust into the face daily. A symbol of national loss. Such is the importance of the mountain that apartments having an Ararat view in Yerevan go for 30% more than ones that do not. After coffee at the hotel, Alexis and I set off to find more about the official Armenian insistence that it was not officially involved in the Karabakh War, or in the forced exit of Azerbaijani civilians from Kelbajar. The official line was still that the conflict was purely between the Karabakh Armenians and the Azerbaijan, and that the armed forces of the Republic of Armenia were not involved at all, aside from the participation of volunteers. Now that official line was starting to change, with pride starting to take the place of discretion. Taking Kelbajar was the only way to save Karabakh, Tigran Nagdalian, the young, unflappable spokesman at the HQ of the nationalist Dashnaktsutian party, told us. The Dashnaks were the central champions of the Nagorno-Karabakh cause. Without having created this security zone, Karabakh would be reliant on a tiny strip of territory, the so-called Lachin Corridor, connecting it to Armenia and facing strangulation, he emphasized. We pointed out that as a result of the Armenian actions, hundreds of non-Karabakhi Azerbaijanis were left to potentially freeze to death in the mountains. Nagdalian held his expression steadily, as if to say, I know, but war is war. International condemnation of Armenian behavior, including a new Security Council resolution demanding the immediate withdrawal of occupying forces, which Armenia chose to interpret as meaning only local Karabakh forces, was starting to grow. Of greater concern in Yerevan was saber-rattling in Turkey about a response to the Armenian offensive and what could be done to aid Azerbaijan. The first act by Ankara was to close the frontier between the border towns of Kars and Gyumri, which had been enjoying a lively trade since the border opening in 1991, but which remains closed as of this writing, 2 decades later. Predictably, Yerevan was rife with rumors that the Turks would do more than just seal the frontier and were planning to pour over the border and finish the eradication of Armenians begun in 1915. The Turks are coming to slaughter us again, declared our receptionist upon our return to our cold and dark hotel. But this time we won't let them. We decided to go check the border for ourselves, climbing back into Alexis's rat-trap Neva, and headed in the general direction of Mount Ararat. It was partially obscured by clouds and mist until we came to a monastery complex called Khor Virab, when the glorious and famous mountains exposed itself to us. Khor Virab was also a deeply revered site, as it is believed to have been the site of the dungeon where St. Georgi the Illuminator spent 13 years, imprisoned for his faith before curing the pagan Armenian king Tridat from a bout of insanity. Tridat then declared Armenia to be the world's first Christian state in AD 301 and spent much of the rest of his days building Christian churches on the sites of former pagan shrines. Even though the monastery is just a few dozen meters from the barbed wire border with Turkey, we saw no trace of any grand Turkish armies ready to sweep across the frontier. Instead, we retreated to one of the ritual animal sacrifices, matag in Armenian, at Khor Virab, that take place on a daily basis and which are a holdover from the pre-Turdat pagan epoch. This time, a rooster was being slaughtered as part of a traditional wedding pilgrimage to the site. A crowd of women in long dresses and men in leather jackets enthusiastically followed behind the bride and groom. The war in Karabakh, the prospect of the Turks pouring over the border, and the grim state of the country, for a few moments at least, distant thoughts. We got back into the vehicle and headed south along the empty road, thinking we might find some real activity in that direction, such as a more militarized area. Long shadows cast a melancholy air onto the brutal, rocky winter landscape. Why did people live here? I asked myself. In search of Turkish troops, we meandered down a back road toward the frontier. Ahead of us, on the right-hand side, was an unmanned sentry booth. Down in the gully, we could see barbed wire, and in the distance, the red and white star and crescent emblazoned Turkish flag. In the border guard huts on the Turkish side, nothing moved. We took out our cameras to take a picture of a silence so deep it seemed to breathe. Suddenly, a short, squat figure appeared in the distance on the Armenian side of the frontier. With one hand, he tugged on the strap from which his Kalashnikov was dangling and started to march toward us, reaching a jog and almost a gallop while dangling the AK behind him. "No pictures," he shouted. "No pictures." We laid down our gear. "What are you doing here?" The now ex-Soviet but still Russian sentry snorted, with an equal mix of reproach and bewilderment. "Hi," said Alexis, in his lilting, disarming London accent, blissfully unaware that the word of greeting in English means Armenian in Armenian. The sentry stared emptily at the glib Alexis as if he were from Planet X. Just as the sentry started to mutter something, another, taller and thinner border guard appeared, tucking in his shirt as he approached us, yawning slightly. "What do you want?" asked the taller one. By his epaulets, he appeared to be a captain. We explained that we were reporters. There was talk in Yerevan, we explained, about Turkish troops massing on the border, and that we had come to check it out. The captain looked at us curiously, smirked, and then opened a gate and waved us inside a barracks-like building. The structure was perched on a promontory over the border area behind the maze of barbed wire and sinister-looking radio towers. We stopped to take a look. The captain told us to keep walking. "The border comes later," he said. Once inside the barracks, he led us into a larger, comfortable room with sofas and coffee tables. He slowly examined our passports and accreditations. "Now, what is it you want?" said the captain. "We want to see the border crossing," I said. The captain rolled his eyes. The border was closed, he said, emphasizing that there had never been a fully functioning crossing point here, not even in peaceful times. This had been a rare spot where NATO member Turkey met the USSR. The captain's wife and 2 more border guards entered the room. They sat down and urged us to do the same. Then the captain went into another room and returned with a bottle of vodka. His wife, a tall woman who took pains to look city stylish despite her isolation on this rocky, lonely border, raced off and roared back, her arms bursting with candies, bread, and some sausage, words flowing ceaselessly from her smiling lips. "You boys must be so hungry. You know, it's so quiet around here, no one to talk to, nowhere to go to have a good time. My girlfriends back in Russia can't understand what I'm doing here. You know, there are some things you have to do in life." Her border guard husband sized her up quizzically, then dismissively. My talk involving rumors about the Turks and paltry ruminations about the starkness of Ararat clearly did not interest him. He told us he was Russian and not Armenian and hailed from Sverdlovsk in western Siberia. He lamented the breakup of the Soviet Union and let us know it in the form of melancholy vodka toasts. He said he had never met an American before. Now he was a man marooned on a distant, foreign border post in the middle of nowhere, and did not know why aside from a lingering sense of communist-era duty, which meant nothing anymore. "Вы понимаете?" he asked rhetorically and repeatedly. "Do you understand?" He poured the vodka around, asking us questions about where we were from and what we were doing. It seemed to be his first human communication in months. His wife tugged at her kinky hair and nodded, adding a feeling of exaggerated importance to our impromptu encounter. "This used to be the border between NATO and the Warsaw Pact," he related. "Now I am guarding the border of a country that doesn't exist anymore, my country, the USSR. It is difficult for me even to look at it that way." Alexis and I nodded in a kind of sympathy. "Soon we will be humiliated into leaving here as well," lamented the captain, muttering to himself. We stayed for over an hour as the captain toasted to peace, love, and friendship between nations, the usual stuff. But as the vodka began to gain its hold, underneath he was clearly still preoccupied over the loss of the empire and his new role as a foreigner guarding a border with another foreign country. It was pretty sad, actually. Finally, as we prepared to leave, the captain pulled me aside. "I have something I want to discuss with you," he said in a low tone. "Yes?" I asked. "Perhaps you and your friend would like to go into business with me." I thought for a split second. Drugs? Weapon running? Loose nuclear materials? "We're not businessmen, we're journalists," I said, but curious about his proposal nonetheless. "Listen, what I have access to is rare stuff." "What do you have?" I asked, playing him like a trout while remembering the would-be gem smuggler I had met back in Leningrad years earlier. "Snake venom," whispered the captain, coming closer to my ear. "Snake venom?" I asked, incredulously. "Top quality," he whispered. "The best." I tried to emphasize that I knew nothing about snake venom or how to maximize its commercial potential, but the captain seemed deaf to my words. "Davai," he cooed. "Come on, it is really good venom. If not you, then maybe you have some friends who we can do business with." So far, our quest to capture the outbreak of hostilities between Turkey and Armenia that might lead to Russian intervention, and thus, theoretically, possibly to World War III, had been less than productive in raw news terms. We'd traveled up and down the border on wild rumors about Turkish troop movements, but had only seen a rooster getting its head ripped off at a monastery and drunk warm vodka with a marooned Soviet border guard cum snake venom peddler. Yet the day's fragmented images made sense in a way. Under the absurdity of it all, the war afoot, the political doublespeak on both sides of the front lines, people went on with their lives, adapting however they could. Another basic truth: journalists wandering around in conflict zones spend more time chasing after wild leads about non-existent troop movements than actually seeing them. We set off back in the direction of Georgia, making a special stop along the border between Armenia and the part of Azerbaijan where Kelbajar is situated. The road leading from the Armenian town of Vardinis was nothing but dried mud ruts. There had been reports that Armenian units had entered from Armenia itself, but this was officially denied in Yerevan, in keeping with the official but implausible line that the war was solely between the 100,000 or so Karabakh Armenians and 7 million strong Azerbaijanis. Escorted by several local officials who had intercepted us, we headed towards the zero zone on the actual frontier, and there we found our story. The ground was damp and clearly imprinted with telltale signs of moving war machines. "BMP tracks," said Alexis, using the Russian acronym for Armored Personnel Carrier, or APC. "Tractor tracks," said our escort from the local administration. "A tractor? Why would a tractor drive into enemy territory?" asked Alexis rhetorically. "To harvest snow-covered wheat during the middle of a war?" The men grinned, sharing with us the silent inside joke of the Armenian government's complicity in at least this part of the ghost war with Azerbaijan over Karabakh. Officially, the Armenians justified their conquest of Kelbajar and areas surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh as the need to establish a security zone around Karabakh that would be given back to Azerbaijan when it recognized Nagorno-Karabakh's independence or when some sort of permanent peace plan was arranged. The men who imagined the offensive on Kelbajar on the Armenian side had other ideas. He was a newcomer to this war but a seasoned veteran of other guerrilla conflicts. An erudite, aesthetic archaeologist by training, he had fought as a volunteer on the pro-Palestinian side in the war in Lebanon and against the Israelis during their invasion in 1982. Then he had taken up the cause of the Kurdish Peshmergas and greatly admired the Bakaa Valley-based Kurdish Workers' Party, or PKK, the Marxist organization fighting for Kurdish rights in Turkey. But at core, his cause was Armenia, and his stated goal that of re-establishing control over what he considered historic Armenian lands, including Mount Ararat and much of present-day eastern Turkey. In the mid-1980s, he became a key figure in ASALA, Armenian Secret Army for the Liberation of Armenia, which engineered bombings against Turkish government targets in Europe and the assassination of Turkish diplomats. He traveled under fake Cypriot and other passports for years, finally ending up spending 3 years in a French jail on weapons-related charges and the possession of forged documents. To his enemies, he was a terrorist. To his supporters, a national icon. His nom de guerre was Commander Avo, although at birth in distant California, his Armenian-American parents had named him Monty, with the family name Melkonian. He was later killed in action at the age of 35 in June 1993 outside the Azerbaijani ghost town city of Agdam, and his funeral was attended by thousands, including the president of Armenia, Laban Ter-Petrosian. But all that would happen later. Back when the Soviet Union was unraveling, it was natural that Melkonian would find his calling in the Karabakh cause. Within only a few months, he developed a reputation in Karabakh as an extremely disciplined commander. As a non-drinker, he was a rarity among his fighters and had ruffled more than a few feathers by insisting on absolute sobriety among them. When he did find them imbibing a bit of homemade moonshine, he was known to demonstratively pour the contents onto the ground, eliciting rage from his subordinates. He also raised many eyebrows among Armenian fighters for a far more serious reason. Those under his command were given strict orders not to harm non-combatants or even Azerbaijani military captives, despite the grisly habit of the locals, on both sides, of senseless, gruesome revenge killings of civilians and soldiers alike. This set of ethics earned him real enemies among his own men, according to a biography about Melkonian's life written by his brother, Markar. He relates the circumstances about a massacre in which several dozen captives, including some non-combatants, were tossed in a ditch, stabbed to death, and some burned alive after ethnic Armenian forces took the Azerbaijani-held town of Karadoglu in 1992. By the time Monty came across the ditch on the outskirts of town, it was a butcher's scrap heap. Monty had given strict orders that no captives were to be harmed. The veins in his neck stood out like braided hemp, and he hollered until he was hoarse. More than 50 Azeri captives had been butchered in Karadoglu, but it was not the butchery that damaged Monty's reputation among the Karabakh mountain people. On the contrary, vengeance ran deep in the mountains, and the loudest voices on both sides demanded blood for blood. What damaged Monty's reputation, rather, was the fact that the butchery at Karadoglu had taken place against his orders. Karadoglu only confirmed what everyone else seemed to know. Avo, the new headquarters chief, was a weakling. But whatever his lesser-minded underlings thought about him, Commander Avo was a master tactician. He had spoken months before about the importance of taking Kelbajar, but the idea was regarded as unrealistic. For Monty, Kelbajar was not an end in itself, nor was Karabakh. It was the natural action that would lead to the recovery of what he considered control over historic Armenian lands. As Markar writes, "But why advance into Kelbajar? No Armenians live there." Monty claimed they had to take Kelbajar because Azeri gunners in the area had launched artillery barrages against Armenian villages. But to him, the operation was not purely, not even primarily, based on security considerations. "This is a historical issue," he told Bagrian. "Current demographics and political boundaries notwithstanding, Kelbajar was part of the Armenian homeland. Of course this is historical Armenia." Monty cited the presence of old Armenian monasteries in Kelbajar as justification for his historic lands argument. Monty Melkonian's moment came during early April 1993 when the Azerbaijanis, having been deserted by commanders like Surat Husseinov, had collapsed all along the Karabakh front. It was then that he decided to launch a lightning strike from Karabakh into Kelbajar from the east, only to discover that he and his men had been beaten to the prize by another Armenian attacking force under the command of a French Armenian, Shishko, or Fatty, coming from the west, meaning Armenia itself. It was the tread tracks of Shishko's armored vehicles that Alexis and I had seen near the border. For Melkonian and Shishko, Kelbajar and other soon-to-be occupied territories of Azerbaijan were not bargaining chips or even part of a temporary security zone, but part of a once mighty, now fragmented ancient Armenian empire that they were reconstructing. Not long after the conquest of Kelbajar, Melkonian pointed out to a British journalist that this was the first time in 1,000 years that Armenians had recaptured land rather than losing it. The logic was clear. In the early 1990s of Armenia, one of the most popular and indeed few souvenirs on sale was a map illustrating Armenia 2104 BC. The cartographical fantasy was one of many indicative of how the aspirations of small, former empires can be fueled by the collapse of a giant one like the USSR. The map included all of present-day Armenia, Karabakh, much of present-day Turkey and Azerbaijan, and parts of Georgia, a land stretching from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean to the Caspian. To be fair, in Tbilisi I also saw maps of ancient and medieval Georgia that included lands long since lost to other countries, mainly Turkey and Russia, and in Azerbaijan I had seen maps of that nation that included much of northern Iran, southern Azerbaijan, as well as chunks of today's Iraq. But in Armenia, the Greater Armenia maps seemed to be everywhere, and believed. It was only a matter of time and faith until the stolen heritage, what some detractors have called the Greater Armenia Project, would be restored and ancient glory revived, and Kelbajar was the first step in that direction. Indeed, 3 years later I found myself in Stepanakert, the capital of Nagorno-Karabakh, which by then had been stitched to Armenia from top to bottom after the conquest of additional Azerbaijani lands and the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijanis. There I met an ethnic Armenian fighter who himself hailed from Lebanon, had fought in the Karabakh War, married a local woman, and was now living in an old Soviet-style apartment building in the town. He was a gracious host, and jugs full of local wine were consumed as the fighter and his Armenian guests sang songs while he strummed a guitar. We began talking about Commander Abo, the late Monty Melkonian, and the official line that the occupied territories would be given back to Azerbaijan once Nagorno-Karabakh's independence was recognized by Baku. "Oh, that is naive," our host said with a warm smirk. "Okay, perhaps a few chunks, but nothing strategic." Then he pointed to what, in the dim candlelit apartment, looked to be a faded tintype on the wall. "That is what keeps us Armenians going," he added with another smile, pouring more wine. It was an image of the indelible Armenian symbol, Mount Ararat. "Surely," I interjected, "Ararat was an understandably painful symbol, but no one realistically thought present-day Turkey would ever relinquish it." "Yes, perhaps you are correct," he said calmly. "But it is like a beautiful woman you desire. Deep in your heart, you know perhaps that she is totally unobtainable, but you keep fighting for her nonetheless." Azerbaijan, the Shish Kebab War and Eastern Democracy. I am sitting on an ancient Baku balcony, a spit of space barely big enough for one along a wide avenue, just down from the shores of the Caspian Sea. The scent of crude oil washing up on the bay from outdated, leaky Soviet oil rigs lingers in the air. Hanem, the henna-haired mother of my cameraman, Adil Bunyatov, serves me never-ending cups of steaming, slightly bitter Azerbaijani tea. As she and others swear in these arid parts, this is a remarkably effective way to calibrate one's body temperature to the heat and obtain equilibrium. We need it. It's over 100 stifling degrees Fahrenheit. The street below me looks serene. Old men in tea houses gathering to share the latest gossip, groups of teenagers kicking an old soccer ball around. Yet Azerbaijan is still at war. Now not only with the Armenians, Azerbaijan is now at war with itself. "The country is falling apart," says Adil, despairingly. The wool merchant come warlord Surat Husseinov, high on battle fumes from his act of treachery in pulling his troops off the front and practically gift-wrapping territory to the Armenians, is not satisfied. His legion of mutinous, motley rebels marched toward the capital, meeting little resistance. They quickly forced President Elchibey to quit, Husseinov's original goal. Not enough for the semi-literate Husseinov, who now smells real blood and riches. Elchibey flees into internal exile. Elchibey temporarily brings in Azerbaijan's former communist-era strongman, the wily Haydar Aliyev, the one-time Soviet Politburo member. It's predicted this will lead to some reconciliation with the rebels. Now it isn't even clear what Husseinov wants, except some warped form of power. He obviously considers this more important than fighting the Armenians, who are, to no one's surprise, taking advantage of the chaos in Baku by chopping off ever greater chunks of Azerbaijan. We head to the front, which is wherever Surat's column of mutinous tanks and APCs have parked for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, or just broken down because of low-octane fuel. We flag down a taxi and head north, along the main road between Baku and the old Azerbaijani capital of Shamaki, 4 hours north, to see what there is to see. Adil Bunyatov has been working as a photojournalist and a TV cameraman for several years, more often than not in the former USSR's myriad conflict zones. This was pre-oil rush Azerbaijan, and working for foreign media outlets was one of the few ways to make a decent living, aside from government-related corruption. By now, he was frustrated with the business of news gathering, which was increasingly coming to mean documenting the descent of his homeland into chaos and comic opera wars, like Surat Huseynov's campaign to take the capital. Although the mainstream international press was terming this a civil war, most of the action involved Huseynov's rebels moving their armored vehicles a few kilometers closer to the capital, and then parking again while the government forces pulled back to the next bridge or hedgerow. There seemed to be no thought of taking territory not directly adjacent to the two main roads out of the capital. The battles were thus relegated to holding or giving up a chunk of asphalt and then going home for the night. Indeed, in the outdoor cafes of Baku, we sometimes saw the same government officers we had seen on the nearby front lines during the day, eating shish kebabs and speaking of the day's brave deeds. Thus, the civil war or internal conflict or Surat Huseynov Putsch or Elchibey ouster became known for what it really was, namely, the shish kebab war. Adil waxed cynical as we puttered along down the road. If I expected war bravado talk from him, I was to be disappointed. With the Soviet downfall, democracy was an abstract concept, but was embraced as a promise that the USSR only needed to inject a bit of it to find the promised land of justice and easy consumerism. In Azerbaijan, this feeling was even more palpable, given the hopes the country's untapped oil reserves represented. Adil Bunyatov, tweaking his thick black mustache, ceased talking about the war altogether and, completely out of the blue, launched into a missive about doing something real instead of covering ceaseless, crazy conflicts. "I want to open a ketchup factory," he said, talking mostly to himself, our car rattling away through the desert. "What?" "You heard me. I want to open a ketchup factory. The problem is, I can't." The collapse of the Soviet economy and the poor quality of merchandise in the USSR meant that nearly all finished consumer goods in Azerbaijan were imported. In the case of ketchup, this was almost economically insane. The country was a veritable hothouse, and tomatoes, cheap, tasty, and in great abundance. Salt, vinegar, and bottles were readily available. The problem with the Dream Project, Adil noted with irritation, was that the country was flooded with ketchup made in Turkey. The reason for this was that the Turkish ketchup, along with everything from German UHT, ultra-high temperature milk, to cheap Chinese candy bars, was imported, and that meant that the Department of Customs folks were working in consort with the Ministry of Economic Development folks to make sure that no ketchup, or milk or chocolate bars, would be produced in Azerbaijan, and were dividing the fat tariffs slapped on the imports between them. By Adil's calculations, a bottle of ketchup from Turkey cost upward of 10 times what he figured he could sell Azerbaijani ketchup for and still make a profit. Perhaps such savings didn't matter much to the expense account oilmen starting to seep into Baku, but it drove Adil up the wall. The ketchup talk was part of Adil's broader monologue on Eastern democracy. Democracy is what Azerbaijanis were promised. Instead, their country was falling apart, losing territory to the Armenians, getting caught up in comic opera wars like the one we were covering, corruption, warlords, crime. Therefore, democracy was increasingly associated with simple anarchy. Adil lamented all of this. He did not believe communism was a better model for Azerbaijan, and yet neither did he believe that the country was ready for real democracy. Ideally, Azerbaijan would have an Eastern democracy, a kind of temporary, benevolent autocracy headed by a type of father figure, similar to those running the new Sultan-type states emerging in Central Asia. Most of their leaders were busy building Sultanate-type regimes, often based around elaborate, if still whimsical, cults of personality. As the 1990s progressed, the whimsical part fell off and an overt, heavy sense of dictatorship and repression took over in almost all of them. Adil had just returned from Turkmenistan, across the Caspian Sea from Azerbaijan. "There is something I would call Eastern democracy," said Adil. He gave an example, noting that the quirky leader of Turkmenistan, Suparmurat Niyazov, who had renamed himself Turkmenbashi, or head of all Turkmen, provided his 4 million subjects with free natural gas, salt, and other basics. These were the early soft years of Turkmenbashi's post-Soviet reign. However, later he would evolve into one of the most erratic, repressive leaders in the world. "It is a kind of social contract," Adil added. He obviously found the sense of order familiar and comforting in a way, compared with the constant battlefield losses to the Armenians and the ongoing, ludicrous civil war we were observing in the steppe and desert north of Baku. "In Eastern democracy, the strong man takes care of the needs of the people. There is law and order," argued Adil. "It is a transitional way to democracy because we are in a transitional situation. Our people are used to a patriarchic system, to having a big man, and that's what they want now." While Adil's catch-up monologue continued, we saw the first APCs parked along the road to Shamaki and a few dozen soldiers. We stopped the car in a dusty clearing at the side of the road and asked which side of the war they were on. These were government soldiers, it turned out. "Where's the front line? Where are Surat's people?" asked Adil. "Right up there." One of the government guys pointed to a nearby hill. There were no more than 100 yards separating the two sides. No trenches, no real fortifications, nothing but 100 yards of air. There was also a conspicuous lack of any noticeable tension between the sides, at least in this place. Aside from one government type taking a quick peek through some binoculars at the rebels, the sides didn't seem to be paying much attention to each other. Having nothing much else to do, the government group decided to show its hospitality by giving us a ride on their APC through the rocky, desert-like terrain, so that we could get a look at the lay of the land. We left the roadway and started down an incline. Soon we were cruising down a dusty trail. I sat atop the APC while Adil filmed through a periscope from inside. We drove for about 3 miles before we approached what looked like some sort of old collective farm building. Nearby there was a square, cement-type block structure. It was a natural well, used for outdoor bathing. The cement slabs blocked our view, but under the fountain of water pouring from a spigot bobbed a woman's head, and she was taking a shower. Our government soldier friends became instantly distracted and began whistling and hollering. Evidently, the driver of the APC was not immune to the charms of the lady's head of hair, for he had apparently taken his eyes off the terrain in front of him. There was a gentle jolt, a wiggle of the wheels, and then the right side of the APC gradually began to elevate in a way I knew it should not. As the vehicle started to lurch, I scrambled to get on the high side, grabbing toward one of the wheels now spinning in the air. Then I felt myself falling off, losing consciousness as I hit the ground. When I came to, I could see the APC teetering on its side above me, rocking slowly toward me. The armored vehicle was about to roll over onto my legs. At the last second, I felt 2 hands pulling me by the arms along the rocky ground just as the multi-ton hulk of military metal slowly somersaulted over exactly where I had been lying, its turrets digging into the sand. Now on my feet, I embraced the soldier who had saved my life, or at least my legs. But the soldiers were less worried about me, or doing battle with the rebel foe, than the reaction of their commanding officer should they return to base without their APC. There were 8 or 9 of us, but I am still amazed at our achievement. Grunting and groaning, we pushed and shoved until finally we managed to prop the APC on its side, and then with another Herculean effort, righted it back on its wheels. Rather than congratulate themselves on our success, however, the soldiers then began cursing one another over the damage, waving their fingers and assigning blame. When one seemed to take too much interest in a Kalashnikov propped on a bush, we knew it was time to go. "Let's get out of here," Adil said. It was a good idea, and I still had my legs. Leaving our friends and the APC behind, we ascended a sandy ridge and kept walking in the general direction of the road, eventually finding it several miles away from where we had left our driver. "You Americans don't really understand. We're not totally ready for democracy, as you call it," Adil said, wiping APC soot and sweat from his brow. "I'm not saying we won't have it eventually, but right now it's too early. This is chaos, not democracy." What Adil really wanted was just a normal life for himself and his family. Prophetically, Azerbaijan would in the coming years take on some of the elements of an Eastern democracy. The former communist strongman Haydar Aliyev conceded to some demands of the wool merchant come warlord Surat Husseinov, including making him prime minister. Within 2 years, however, Aliyev outsmarted Surat, who ended up in prison for several years on charges of coup plotting. The Haydar Aliyev clan, helped by new oil money, then built an authoritarian system with all the whistles and bells, handing off power to Haydar's son Ilham before Haydar's death, holding sham elections, and engineering the total dominance of the state over most aspects of life. We got back to the car and continued to the ancient town of Shamaki, the former capital of Azerbaijan, probably crossing the front several times without knowing it because the sentries were asleep or something. There were a few gun-toting men hanging around the main administration building, and we met a city official inside who said merely that he was on the side of peace, but we had no idea who was in control, and no one seemed to want to tell us. "Let's go back to Baku to see who is in power today," Adil suggested sarcastically. "Okay," I said. Aside from my near death by APC, it had been an enlightening day. A civil war that was barely won, the lone government casualty the wrecked piece of military hardware. Indeed, the real war was elsewhere, and receiving almost no news coverage because one had to cross the lines of the Shish Kebab war to get there. That real war, of course, was being fought over Karabakh, and during that white-hot summer, Azerbaijan's battlefield losses to Armenia continued unabated. The most notable loss came in July, when Azerbaijani troops lost the frontline city of Agdam, once home to 70,000 souls, but already largely abandoned by civilians. The Armenians then carted away doors, window frames, and even the white bricks used to build the houses as war booty. I made it to within a few miles of Agdam the day after it fell, and saw it burning in the near distance, the fate of all fallen cities in all the Caucasus wars. There, I met the last Azerbaijani unit along the road, a platoon of 20 or so. The commander, distraught and on the edge of a nervous breakdown, insisted on digging up a dead comrade to show me. There was no corpse, only a perfectly flattened head remained, which the by now inconsolable commander pried up with a stick and displayed to me. He claimed it had been intentionally run over by an Armenian tank as his forces retreated. I thought of my own narrow escape from getting crushed by the flip-flopping APC outside Shamaki. I listened to the commander wail and wave around the head of his friend with Agdam burning in the background, the requisite wave of refugees, cars loaded down with rescued refrigerators, blankets, and mattresses pulling away from the area. And I would have to file again from the chaos of Azerbaijan a few years after the fall of Agdam and the Shish Kebab war, and this time the subject was Adil Bunyatov, my friend and cameraman. Less than 2 years after Adil's dreams of opening a ketchup factory and his soliloquy about Eastern democracy and speculations about whether Azerbaijan might be better off with a little benign dictatorship instead of the chaos that came with gradual moves toward broader political freedoms, the autocratic government of Haydar Aliyev was faced with a new rebellion. Adil went forth to do his job of finding and filming the front, which this time took the form of a suburban military barracks in Baku. But unlike the Shish Kebab War of the summer of 1993, This was an all-too-real confrontation pitting Azerbaijani against Azerbaijani, and when the guys with guns on either side of the political divide fired their weapons, it was in anger and with intent to kill. When the smoke cleared, dozens of soldiers lay dead. The rogue officer behind the rebellion was allowed to bleed to death on his way to the hospital. Adil was no longer there to report it. He was killed in the opening blast when a stray bullet struck his jugular. The doctors tried to reassure his family, which included a wife and son, that his death had probably been very quick and almost painless. He was the first of my close reporting friends and colleagues to be killed in action. He would not be the last. And that is the end of part 3 of 8 Pieces of Empire. I will end this reading with an Azerbaijani folk song. Thank you for listening to the Workers' Reading Room. Have a good evening.